this is, when we planned this thing, we we did not know that Biden would do the right thing. We did not trust that Biden would do the right thing, and we're pretty stunned and elated. We are still kind of waiting for it to sink in. So this is a celebration, but there is also a lot of work to be done. We are talking about the circumstances that landed Leonard in prison. He should have not been there a minute. This man sacrificed 49 years of his life and his body. He'll get it back. But the conditions persist. You know, this government incorporated on stolen land with stolen labor, and they've been after resources ever since. Before we begin, I have a message from Leonard. Okay, go ahead, Leonard.
Committee and helped us rebuild the Defense Committee. That's quite well. And I want to thank everyone for helping us, believing in us. I assure you that was from my direction, so everything they did was legal and up and up. And, I really am grateful for you. We probably will keep the Ad Hoc Committee going because there's other things that we have to do to get into court to get this case resolved. So please continue to support us, and I will be very grateful, and I will say more when I get out. Thank you.
Leonard's excited. He's excited. But as he said, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done. And at this point, there should be no question about who is authorized to collect money for Leonard Peltier. He has stated very firmly it is the Ad Hoc Committee, and we will be changing our name to the Leonard Peltier Support Committee because that's what we will be doing. This is a celebration. This is a deep dive into what is wrong with this country and maybe what we can do to take a few steps to make it right. And it's also a fundraiser because this man must never want for anything again in his life. He told me, it occurred to him last night, he's going to need a good winter coat for North Dakota. So if anybody here wants to buy Leonard Peltier a good winter coat, just go to our website and send an email to the ad man. And if anyone wants to donate to make sure that Leonard never again wants for anything in his lifetime, we would deeply appreciate it. His attorney has a trust. We are very transparent with our money. As Leonard says, we go to great lengths to do everything legally. I want to introduce first scholar Ward Churchill, Professor Natsu Saito, and Tracker Quinones all on our board. Ward and Natsu are going to talk about what went wrong with this country. Ward, you want to lead us off?
See you. Yeah. What went wrong with this country is, well, what they used to call them when they were coming from Southeast Asia, the boat people came. Predator came, as John Trudell put it. But the core of this is, yeah, it was this country, so-called, was constructed on the basis of stolen land, stolen labor, stolen resources of the land, and the elimination of the original population. We come to a term that applies to that aspect of the history in the term, which was coined in 1944, or at least published in 1944 for the first time, genocide. It does not mean, as it was rather flippantly defined when I was an undergraduate, after I came back from Vietnam, it does not mean the eradication of a gene pool. Genes, not biological sense or any other, have nothing to do with it. Genocide is a process that was described at the time the term was coined by an exiled Polish Jewish jurist by the name of Raphael Lemkin in a book published in 1944 titled Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. You can find it commencing on page 79. There's a whole chapter devoted to it. Genocide, he said, is nothing new. It is an ancient crime that has been perpetrated numerous times historically that we're aware of, we being Lemkin and the readership of his book, which is to say, so-called Western or European culture or European derivative culture. There were perhaps other instances that have occurred in human history, but these were not what he was addressing. What he said was any process basically undertaken by a central authority to eradicate a defined human group. They do the defining. As such, can be done in a number of ways. And this is where I encountered the reality that of all the places that I've spoken, engaged in more than 50 years of active participation in these processes and activism, is least understood here in the United States. There may be other places, societies that I am not familiar with, where it is equally poorly understood, but this is by far the most ignorant, that is to have the information available and ignore it in terms of definition of any society I've encountered. Genocide ultimately is accomplished by way of eradicating the culture, not the people, eradicating the society by which the people exist, interact, govern, and understand themselves as a people in being. What we have is this chapter that was published in 44 in Axis Rule ultimately becomes, in much diluted and deformed manner, the 1948 United Nations Convention on Punishment and Prevention, or actually that's backwards, prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. That's the first element of international law put in place by the UN. The United States did much to dilute Lemkin's understanding of the word that he coined, and Lemkin incidentally had been appointed to take the more prominent or leading position in drafting the initial document that was then submitted to the United Nations General Assembly, discussed and hashed and revised and altered, and you end up with the 48 convention. The United States did much to eliminate economic aggregates and political aggregates from consideration as protected classes, but didn't sign. It was not ratified, and this is really something that needs to be cognated by the general population out there, particularly those who consider themselves enlightened and progressive and all the rest of that. In 1948, the convention was passed by the General Assembly. By 1952, a sufficient number of member states of the United Nations. Now, that's something else we're not going to quite get into here because it would require a lot of excavation, exploration, articulation. But the United Nations ought to be called the United States, actually, since you've got to be a state to become a member. But, you know, the name was already taken. So you end up with this little thing where when you say a nation, people understand you to be talking about a state. But let's put it this way, there's a couple hundred states on the planet today, and there's about 4,000 nations and probably more than that. So nations, as originally defined, the locus really is on indigenous populations. So you have entities like India, which didn't exist before British imperialism, that has 300 odd nations encompassed within one status boundary. And you can kind of see how that's playing out here. Well, my count is there's about 300, 350, somewhere in that range of nations that understood themselves as such in one way or another. At the time the invasion began, the federal government now recognizes 570 plus nations at present, and the number keeps going up. And what part of that has to do with dividing peoples into separate groups so they can compete with one another, divide and conquer. But what we end up with in 48 convention that the United States couldn't bring itself to sign because it would interfere with its sovereign prerogative. One assumes to commit genocide, and that would be accurate, but it's not something they'd ever admit. It becomes clearer in 1988 when they signed the convention, finally. Basically, you've got a sovereignty package that's attached to the U.S. ratification of the Genocide Convention 40 years after the fact. 1952, it became international law. It's considered customary law at present. But I'll leave that for Natsu Saito, who is going to get more into the legal dimension of things in the next presentation. All right. Genocide is any policy undertaken to eliminate, in whole or in part, not necessarily in the entirety, it says clearly, in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Again, as defined by the perpetrators, there are not one, but 5 criteria listed, and this is the reduced list. Okay, Lemkin had been clear that it was possible to effect genocide by killing the entirety of a group. Okay, the targeted group could be physically exterminated, and he's speaking as a Polish Jew towards the end of World War II, without complete, but nonetheless, a whole lot of knowledge about what the Nazis have been doing to the Jews of Eastern Europe, beginning in Poland and carrying out through what is now the Ukraine. It was the Ukraine then too, but nonetheless the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. Okay. So 1/5 of the diminished definition, the legal definition, has to do with killing members of the group. In the Secretariat's draft, he's clear. There's direct killing. You know, you line people up alongside a anti-tank ditch and shoot them in the back of the head and drop the bodies into the ravine that you've created. And that's direct killing. Auschwitz, marching people into gas chambers and then removing or eliminating the bodies in crematoria. That's another. But he's also talking about the imposition of slow death measures. So you got direct killing, which is quick, and you got slow death measures, which has to do with denying adequate nutrition, medical assistance, shelter, heating, things like that. Takes a while. People die slowly, miserably. You got the examples of that in the ghettos in the Second World War, which he was concerned with. But you've also got many other examples. With killing, I'm not even going to go into killing very much in a direct sense here. The whole history of the United States had to do with pattern of extermination, that kind of genocide. But you've also got American Indians who are pushed onto reservations in what was thought to be the most worthless and useless chunks of real estate remaining in North America. Turns out to be some of the most mineral rich, irony of ironies, and that's the minerals are certainly extracted and utilized to the benefit of the general population. And Indians are living basically in tar paper shacks, many in cars, on heating grates and so forth. Absolutely poorest population in North America, American Indians, with life expectancy of reservation-based males of 44 and a half years, circa 1970. Women living about 8 years longer, but general population males were living about 70 years at the time. Women, American Indian women, were living multiple, about 6 years longer than their men, which made it seem like they were doing better, but general population women were living 8 years longer than their men. So women were actually even worse off than the men in terms of life expectancy. Now, that's slow death measures. It's about a third of a generation when you look at the disparity in life expectancy between American Indians in 1970 and American general population. There's about a third of a life in between both male and female. So if you're looking at a third of the population being eliminated every generation for the 20th century, well, you've got it. That's genocide. It said in whole or in part, and this is systematic and policy driven. Moving to the second policy criteria is to impose conditions inflicting serious mental, by which I meant psychological in essence, or physical harm upon the population. Well, what I was just talking about, indicates physical harm of extreme form. So it's overlapping with killing, but it's not another way of saying killing, okay? Because those who are surviving for the longer periods are simply suffering longer. They really have no quality of life. It's been destroyed. Psychological harm. Well, if you're living in those conditions, there's going to be psychological harm, but there's also 2,000 Hollywood movies depicting Indians the way the perpetrating society would want them depicted to, on the part of the perpetrating society as a whole. They would want them to have been in order to minimize the cost and consequence psychologically to themselves for the eradication that has occurred. And that's not to count things like Jeep Cherokees, teepee motels, Hiawatha writing pencils, Big Chief writing tablets, and on and on. All these products out there which are trivializing and sports team mascots and all the rest of that, which is just overwhelming through the first 3/4 of the 20th century, and then becomes heavily contested thereafter. But the contestation itself has psychological consequences, so you have that. The third criteria has to do with creating conditions that lead to the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. Well, again, overlapping what I've talked about with the first two criteria, at least as concerns slow death measures, although quick death has not gone away entirely either. We had this whole thing about American Indian women disappearing wholesale, murder of women and men as well, although not presently in terms of the death rate at the level of American Indian women, but in the high plains in the 1970s, Indian men were being tortured and sometimes killed for sport, run over, yeah, and so on. But the physical destruction of the group, you can make the case with the in part of in whole and in part, but you've also got things like the relocation and dispersal of the Big Mountain Diné. That's the largest enclave of relatively traditional economy in North America at the time, targeted for removal to cities and dispersal. The people may live. People may live. Each individual that's relocated may be alive, but the group dispersed across North America, rather than having the coherence of their proximity to one another, the cohesion as a community and a culture and so on, it's gone. It's gone. That's genocide in Arizona in the mid 1980s as a matter of policy undertaken by the United States. And it was undertaken in the subterfuge that said that the Hopi, who don't spread out across the land anyway, have been deprived of their property. Their property just happened to conform more or less precisely to a coal field. Coal was still a premium resource at the time, and the Kayenta mine in Black Mesa was one of the biggest in the country, rivaled by the Fort Union extraction of coal up in Sioux country, Crow country, Northern Cheyenne country, up there, Wyandotte mine, and so on. There you have it. The extraction of uranium in Indian country as well. That's what I said. Resources that were found in this supposedly valueless, arid, semi-arid land that was set aside in West for American Indian reservations, so Indians could die off out of sight and out of mind. Yeah, there you have it. There you have it. Dispersal, eradication of culture as a matter of policy it would be more complicated to explain how that eradication of culture by policy would have applied as equally to the Hopis, but we need to go forward. The fourth has to do with prevention of births. Well, allow me to say that by the end of the 1970s, roughly 40% of all American Indian women of childbearing age had been involuntarily sterilized, often unwittingly sterilized. Now, in fairness, it should be said that it wasn't only Indians. Okay, they were sterilizing poor black women and about the same proportion of the women on the island of Puerto Rico. But we're concerned here with Indians. It would be genocidal with respect to the other two groups as well. But yes, prevention of births, compulsory sterilization be one way, segregation of the sexes would be another. Both of those have occurred in incarceration rates for American Indian men in particular has to do with the segregation of the sexes still. So the birth rate, replacement rate for those who are dying prematurely at the time is greatly curtailed. And it should be pointed out that you can genetically, biologically eradicate an entire population with a compulsory sterilization program that is complete in a single generation. Okay, there's simply no more than there. They were unable to reproduce, and yet you have killed no one. There is no direct killing involved. Not even slow death measures would need to be applied. And the fifth and final one, which was really important to Limken, was the only thing that was really directly part of his cultural genocide component on the Secretariat's draft, is the compulsory transfer of children from the targeted group to the targeting group. The earlier the age, the better, but there now you really have in the assimilation program the U.S. implements in the late 19th century, you have the so-called boarding schools, residential schools, as they're called in Canada, okay, where roughly, once the thing got rolling, roughly half of every generation of American Indian children for 5-6 generations were transferred through these facilities, and that's they're forcibly removed, coercively removed from their family, from their community, from their society, from their culture, and shipped to remote locations for residential schooling, training to be, low-level manual labor kind of employees, maids, washerwomen, whatever. Depends on what sex. A lot to be said about that too, but they were forbidden to practice their spiritual traditions, to speak their languages, to eat their food, to wear customary dress, to maintain possession of spiritual items, and so on and so on. The point, according to at the time he started it, Captain Richard Henry Pratt, becomes a brigadier general because he does it for the rest of his career. Prison warden named Pratt, he was an Army officer, ran Fort Marion Prison, where Geronimo and the Cheyenne Dog soldiers and others were sent. He starts to ply his trade on children, okay? And it is to kill the Indian in every single student in order to save the man, all right? To be human, that's what he meant by man. You couldn't be an Indian. Okay, to be an Indian, you were not human. And that process of cultural eradication was continued into the 1980s, and Phoenix Indian School is still running towards the end of that decade. So, you know, there's longevity involved in that. There's also systematically nationwide an adoption program. Indians were taken from their families, Indian children taken from their families to be raised by whites. A number of these, a great proportion, were blind adoptions, so that the child would be denied knowledge of who the parents were, who his people or her people were. You know, in my own experience, we had twin boys that were being raised in Boulder, Colorado, that were, we accepted them into the program because they looked like they'd stepped right off the nickel. They were phenotypically as Indian as it was possible to be, but had no knowledge of which people, you know, were they Cheyennes? Were they Creeks? Were they didn't know. They had no knowledge of their family. They had no knowledge of their community. They had no knowledge of their cultural heritage. And that whole idea was to simply absorb what remained of Indians by the beginning of the 20th century into the settler overburden. Well, this is not atypical, okay? Jean-Paul Sartre, French philosopher, supporter of the Algerian liberation struggle, prepared a paper called On Genocide. It was prepared for the Russell Tribunal, looking at the United States comportment in Southeast Asia during the 1960s, the Vietnam War, so-called. You know, he primarily in that essay wrote about what France had done in Algeria as a way of shedding light on what the U.S. was doing in Southeast Asia and one of its important dimensions. And drew a conclusion, not a direct quote, but allow me to paraphrase what lesson he drew from the study, and that is that colonialism and every American Indian territory in the United States is colonially dominated by the United States government. They talk about sovereignty, but they talk about sovereignty the way municipalities and states do. Okay. The tribal governments are all operating under the authority of the U.S. Department of Interior. They are colonized. Settler colonialism is the issue, but I think, again, Natsu Saito will talk about that in greater extent than I am. But irrespective of the form of colonialism, what Sartre concluded was that in order to impose and maintain a colonial order, it was necessary to inflict genocide in one or another or several forms on the colonized population. So decolonization is the antidote to genocide, and that's precisely what the American Indian movement was about. They had not framed it. We had not framed it quite the fashion I just have at that time, when the American Indian movement in the so-called long 60s, running into 70s, running towards 1980, that period, the period in which Leonard Peltier, in defense of indigenous rights, went to prison. We were fighting genocide. We were fighting for self-determination, which is to say, decolonization. Even then, we understood about settler colonialism, even if we did not have the vernacular worked out and the terminology and all of the case studies that have been done since. Very important. Two other things I want to say, and then I will shut up because I'm talking too long. All right. First is cultural genocide. A lot of my scholarly colleagues would like to tell you should properly be called ethnocide. And I'll refer you right back to Raphael Lemkin and the coinage of the term. On page 79 of Axis Rule, in a footnote at the bottom, he points out in explaining how he arrived at the, the terming, coming up with the term genocide. He said, I could as easily have called this ethnocide, but, for various points of preference, I prefer genocide. Genocide and ethnocide are synonyms. So don't talk to me about the lesser crime of ethnocide. That's a ruse that's undertaken to try to take it out of the legal channel because there is no convention on prevention or punishment of the crime of ethnocide. Ethnocide and genocide are synonymous. Okay, if we're talking about eradication of a culture. That's one. Two, there's this little matter of ethnic cleansing. We got a guy in North Texas University by the name of, I think Adams or Abrams, one or the other. Yeah, wants to talk about U.S. crime of ethnic cleansing, something of much lesser consequence. Not nice, mind you, but of much less consequence. Nothing in U.S. history or nothing in Texas history, he writes on all of them, rose to the level of being properly construed as genocide. Well, ethnic cleansing is a term that was introduced by a couple of journalists in news coverage of the Balkans conflict back in the 1990s. It has no standing in law at all. And insofar as it's a descriptive aspect of anything, and it could be, the objective to clear a territory of its population could be called ethnic cleansing, but it's simply a modality of genocide. It's not something that was put forth anywhere other than newsprint and seized upon by convenience by so-called scholars who want to prevent proper understanding of the course of U.S. history and the situation of American Indians within it. With that, I'll turn this over to my colleague and partner, Natsu.
Thank you. Hey. Okay. Thank you. It's really an honor to join this panel. I wanted to add that Ward and I are both speaking from Atlanta, where we're on Muskogee Creek homelands. And I wanted to express my appreciation to the Ad Hoc Committee and the committees that have worked to support and free Leonard Peltier for so many years. Also to Jennifer Jones and the many attorneys who have also put in work over all of these 50 years. Like many of you, my prayers are with Leonard in this time of transition. I wanted to talk about one of the genocidal aspects of this case in particular, and that's the US government's insistence that those indigenous peoples who have survived all those other forms of genocide perpetrated on them, the ones that Ward was just talking about, the government's insistence that they assimilate into the dominant culture rather than exercising their right to self-determination. We know that Leonard Peltier hasn't been in prison for nearly 50 years for a crime that even his prosecutors can't say that he committed. As Ward has emphasized on many other occasions, the blatant illegality of his incarceration is part of the point that the government is making. Throughout this case, the government's intent has been to make it clear that these are the courts of the conqueror, as Justice Marshall pointed out in 1823, that justice can be arbitrarily denied at any point to those who disrupt the status quo, and that the military might of the state can and will be used to suppress any movement that questions the legitimacy of the occupation and exploitation of this continent. All through US history, there's been a concerted effort to deny American Indian sovereignty, both in theory and in practice. This is part of the continuing effort to legitimize the colonial occupation of this continent and to attribute the ongoing effects of Indian dispossession, all the genocidal measures we've been talking about, to poverty and discrimination. In this framing, this very assimilationist framing, the solution to what they have consistently called the Indian problem is not decolonization, but assimilation. And the government and those in power have attempted to transform American Indians into a racial minority rather than recognizing them as peoples. And once you frame the problem as difference, the solution becomes sameness. But assimilationism, the imposition or requirement of assimilation, is genocidal. Right? As Ward was pointing out, colonialism is genocidal, and this is a settler colonial state. In classic or external European colonialism, the colonizers typically claimed lands, exploited the labor and natural resources of those who lived there, sent the profits back to the so-called mother country, and ultimately returned home themselves. But in a settler state like this one, the colonizers came to stay. They rejected control by their mother country and instead presumed a prerogative, a God-given prerogative, according to them, to establish their state on somebody else's land, to create social, political, legal, economic institutions solely for their own benefit, and to decide who may not, or must live within their claimed borders. That's why the anthropologist Patrick Wolfe, who's studied settler colonialism, famously described it as a structure, not an event. It's not something that happened in the past. It's what we live with now, every day. And these colonizers have always claimed a civilizing mission, what Anthony Angie describes as the grand project that has justified colonialism as a means of redeeming the backward, aberrant, violent, oppressed, undeveloped people of the European world by incorporating them into the universal civilization of Europe. This redemption, so called, was the rationale for eradicating the cultures, languages, histories of those being colonized, as well as their structures of self-government. And it's that intent to erase the identity of a people as such that led Sartre to conclude that colonialism is necessarily and inherently genocidal. Maintaining colonial rule also requires what Angie calls the dynamic of difference, the process of creating a gap between cultures, demarcating one as universal and civilized and the other as uncivilized, and seeking to bridge that gap by so-called normalizing the less civilized one. Among other things, this leads to the construction of racial classifications that facilitate the colonial project by keeping colonized peoples in a perpetually subordinated position. And it's counterintuitive, but racialization can also lead to the nullification of identity. And that's because once the so-called race problem is constructed as one of difference, the race solution becomes the elimination of difference. And as Ward pointed out, the intended destruction of a racial, national, ethnic, or religious group as such, in other words, destroying its groupness, is genocidal. And that's straight from the Convention on Genocide. Assimilationism has been a critical strategy for the US government because if Native peoples can be disappeared into the general population, their land claims and challenges to settler hegemony disappear. This explains a lot about why the US government has outlawed indigenous cultural and spiritual practices, undermined traditional modes of governance, forced Indian children into boarding schools, terminated parental rights, and unilaterally declared American Indians to be US citizens. Although apparently that might change soon. We'll see. And for those who might want to assimilate, it's important to remember that assimilation is a two-way street. Those who are excluded have to want to and be able to merge into the dominant culture, but also mainstream society has to want to absorb them. And this rarely happens because difference is what maintains privilege. But in the meantime, touting assimilationism as a goal makes it seem as if indigenous peoples are only temporarily excluded, and it paves the way for vilifying or criminalizing those who failed to assimilate. According to Lorenzo Versini, an Italian philosopher, he says this is crucial to the disavowal of the inherently political character of indigenous demands. I just want to repeat that. He's saying assimilationism is crucial to the disavowal of the inherently political character of indigenous demands. And this, I think, is exactly what was happening in the 1960s and 70s. Decolonization movements were sweeping across Africa and Asia, and here in the US, many people of color framed their struggles in terms of national liberation. But the activists who were asserting political demands were depicted as criminals and imprisoned or killed as such. It's a bit ironic in our case, as American Indian activists, and AIM in particular, were actually insisting on law enforcement, on compliance with treaties, on prosecution of those who assaulted or killed American Indians, on ensuring basic health, education, and religious freedoms for Indian people. You might remember these efforts included the occupation of Alcatraz. Some of these are American Indian activists in general, and some are AIM, but the occupation of Alcatraz and of Fort Lawton near Seattle, as well as later the Yellow Thunder occupation in the Black Hills, fishing rights struggles in the Northwest, the Trail of Broken Treaties, including its occupation eventually of the BIA building, the response to the federal siege of AIM members and supporters at Wounded Knee in 1973, and their ongoing protection of traditional people on Pine Ridge and Indian people more generally in cities and rural towns. Leonard Peltier, of course, was directly involved in many of these struggles. During that era, there was a lot of social turmoil and a lot of political activism. But assertions of indigenous sovereignty by American Indian activists were perceived as particularly threatening because they brought national and global attention to the underlying illegality of the occupation of North America. These actions were intended to pressure the state to complying with its own law and to the international law it had helped create. But they disrupted the master narrative and the civilizing mission it still relies on to justify the very existence of this country. The Cherokee artist Jimmy Durham, who was the International Indian Treaty Council's first permanent representative to the United Nations, observed that the United States was, quote, the first settler colony to establish itself against and through the denial of its original inhabitants. The result, he said, is a culture based entirely on an ideological master narrative. If colonialism were to end, where would the United States go? It is only a state, he said, only a political entity, nothing else. So its ideological base and its narrative must be absolute. The repression of AIM, and therefore of Leonard Peltier, I think, was about quashing threats to the narrative that glorifies the colonial conquest of the continent. This repression was intended to demonstrate that the government had no obligation to comply with the rule of law, whether that law took the form of treaties with Indian nations or the basic rules of criminal procedure and evidence that were flagrantly violated in Leonard's case. And of course, the repression was also about protecting the state's right to continue stealing Indian lands and resources. It wasn't a coincidence that the day before the Fed's intended assault on the AIM camp on the Jumping Bull land, just the day before, control of about 1/8 of the entire Pine Ridge Reservation had been quietly transferred to federal agencies so that the uranium, molybdenum, and other rare minerals on that land could be placed in the strategic resource reserve of the US government. Leonard Peltier has been imprisoned all this time because he came to represent the contemporary struggles of American Indian nations to exercise their sovereignty, to be self-determining. International law recognizes that all peoples have the right to self-determination and that, quote, by virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. This is stated in a number of UN General Assembly declarations and in the common first article of the two most important human rights treaties, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. According to the UN Human Rights Committee, it has been given this primary position and emphasis because it's an essential condition, they said, for the realization of all individual human rights. And the International Court of Justice has said that the right to self-determination is a jus cogens norm. That means it's law that's binding on all states all the time. Lumbee law professor Rob Williams summarizes it as, quote, the idea that human beings, individually and as groups, should be in control of their own destiny and that systems of government should be devised accordingly and not imposed upon them by alien domination. The really beautiful thing about self-determination is that while we'd like the state to acknowledge the right, its exercise is not contingent on state approval. Self-determination is a continuing right, not an event, but a process. It's for the people to decide, and the people can assert some control over their destinies under almost any circumstance. In 1971, the International Court of Justice decided a case concerning the independence of Namibia, formerly known as Southwest Africa. South Africa had argued that Namibia's legal standing had been erased by its history of colonization. And that's, of course, what we're told here, right? That the history of colonization has erased indigenous sovereignty. But Justice Amun, the vice president of the International Court of Justice, made it clear that we have agency in this process. He insisted that, quote, the Namibian people asserted its international personality by taking up the struggle for freedom. Sovereignty, he said, is inherent in every people, just as liberty is inherent in every human being, and it therefore did not cease to belong to the people as a result of their colonization. Rather, quote, it had simply for a time been rendered inarticulate and deprived of freedom of expression. Depriving American Indian sovereignty of freedom of expression. This is what the US government has been trying to do by keeping Leonard Peltier imprisoned for the past half-century, but it hasn't succeeded. In fact, the arbitrary and blatantly illegal nature of his incarceration has highlighted the illegitimacy of the continued dispossession of indigenous peoples on this continent and across the planet, and the continued occupation and exploitation of their lands. And American Indian peoples have asserted their international personality by taking up the struggle for freedom. Leonard will always be a symbol of colonized peoples' continued resistance to genocide and the right of all indigenous peoples to self-determination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natsu and Ward. And I am just thrilled Leonard is going to be able to see this. All these webinars and videos we've been doing, I'm thinking, man, I wish he's going to get to see this. And your words are going to light him up. Edgar Running Bear said that when AIM came to Pine Ridge, they finally had a sense of safety. I mean, their own people were killing them and they did not understand why. And Leonard brought prayer and tradition and told people, you are worthy of being people. They did not recognize American Indians as people back then, and they still don't in a lot of places. I want to bring on Tracker Quinones, who is AIM all the way through, is a woman on fire. First, I would like to thank Jennifer Jones, though, and I keep forgetting that. Jennifer is Leonard's lead counsel, and she has been his hero for a couple of years now. She cares about the man behind the political prisoner, which is different. But back to Tracker, she will speak on the spiritual significance of taking Leonard from his people and getting him back. Virginia Crow Dog told me once that when you try to break a people, you take what's precious to them. On Pine Ridge, they not only killed people, they shot their dogs. Leonard Crow Dog walked out and found his 6 sorrel horses shot dead. And they took Leonard from Indian country, but Indian country is getting him back. So Tracker, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to Ward and Natsu too. And thank you to Jennifer Jones. And thank you to Indian Country, the world, and the global outreach that has been happening since he has been incarcerated. I wanted to say my name is Tracker Anakipna Sanawus Gina Marie Rangel. And so I wanted to touch on what Ward said. Yes, this is important. The relocation and disruption, criminal disruption of Native peoples in America are tied to a long history of systemic violence that we have been seeing, that has been happening to the Indigenous people, but now it's on the doorstep and in the Native countries of all people around the world. It's systemic. The displacement and policies designed to undermine Indigenous sovereignty. Here's like the historical and ongoing impacts of the relocation and forced removal, the Trail of Tears in 1830. Still, the Dene people today were being relocated up to 2010 when they lifted the Bennett freeze. So these things that are happening, and we are also seeing historical erasure around the world, where they're actually tearing down buildings, taking artifacts, and pillaging is what they're doing, and creating that ethnocide and genocide. So we are looking at some positive things here, and but under the Indian Removal Act, like he was speaking about in 1830, thousands of Native Americans were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands in the southeastern and designated Indian territory. And they came up with actually with the Indian Removal Act. And so that was something that, lasted for years. And they say that the Indigenous people, there's a lot of myths and misinformation about the Indigenous people scalping, but it was actually, it was actually a campaign that the Pilgrims had, that they had during the Civil War, during the relocation, that they would pay people to scalp, and they had certain prices on each head, men, women, and children. So it disrupted our way of life and traditional food sources, our cultural practices. Termination and urban relocation programs, federal policies aim to dissolve tribal governments, termination acts, and relocation. So we've been facing these things, as Ward talked about extensively. So I do want to also say that, the American Indian movement, upholding a grassroots vision, the American Indian movement remains grounded in traditional values and leadership and Indigenous First Nation communities. The original vision of the aunties and uncles created AIM. The purpose was to protect communities, provide with food and security. And they were going to be, and that was the leadership that we were looking at. And still today, we're grounded in that leadership and that spiritual, spearhead of connecting to the communities and ceremony. So the vision led by true AIM Indigenous leaders, rooted in ancestral knowledge, cultural traditions, and frontline advocacy for the sovereignty rights and the well-being of our people and the land. So we're here to organize and amplify the prayer and the voices of the leaders. And Leonard Peltier is AIM. All Sundancers are AIM. And so we continue to stand in solidarity, amplifying our cause and providing resources for First Nation frontline efforts. So in the coming days, we'll share definitions of support roles, what it means to be a supporter, how you can help, actionable steps, way to contribute to AIM's grassroots work, including advocacy, education, and direct action, and tools to guide supporters effectively engaging with AIM efforts. Leonard Peltier, he has endured years and years of not only being able to transmute and transition all that oppression, suppression into a positive action through his artwork, through his writings. And he has a lot more to say. It's only the beginning for him. And I know that like the elders are speaking now and the spiritual leaders, and they are saying that this is the beginning of his life and the next chapter for him. So as we move forward to support him in that next chapter, what does that look like? It's something that is respecting his privacy, respecting his walk and his path upon this red road, the spiritual journey of profound healing, a healing that needs to take place for him, for the people, his family, and then for the world. And he has been an advocate for you while he was sitting in that cell, while he was sitting in that prison all those years. He's been incarcerated for nearly 5 decades. So let's just say that. Let's look at it as what it is, and we can move on. And I know that, as we know, Leonard Peltier is a man of unity. He's a man of integrity and a man of his word. So the reconnection with his people, he's expressed a deep longing to reconnect with his family, friends, and the broader Native American communities and the world. So as we look, advocacy for Native rights, even from prison, he remained committed to the cause he believes in, and that is going to change the world. So while he was in there, he changed the world. His heart would sing when he would hear people doing action. And so that's something that we really want to take into consideration, that he was there for us as well. So as we move along, though, I would like to really say something and press upon the fact that, there's things that are happening. There's a lot of noise out there. And what we really want to do is make sure that the connection to his life and him starting over in a new chapter, that his spiritual walk, his healing, those things are more prominent than all of the other things that are being said and the speculation and the controversy. It's important to review historical context that's available through evidence research, and to understand why Peltier is not implicated in the death of Anna Mae, so that he can move on. And a lot will be said and a lot will be done. And like Don said, this is just the beginning. So despite persistent misinformation, we're going to advocate for Indigenous rights, and we're going to particularly do the work through the vision of AIM as well. So I would like to say that, things that we're doing to bring that broader perspective is reaching out. There's a lot of things that are happening now that are going to change history for AIM, because I believe that we're all going to be standing up and standing in with unity. So, there's a big thing that is said, and that's always something that we talk about, and that is that, AIM was founded on that vision, and that vision was to be able to connect to the people. And so I just wanted to say that thank you to each and every person that signed the petition, that walked or ran, that was able to speak or advocate, or even if you did the research to learn what it is we're looking at and the truth and the facts. So also, the factual information about Peltier's innocence regarding Anna Mae's case through books, documentaries, media, legal advocacy, go and look at the FBI files related to AIM, COINTELPRO, and do your own research in your. So if you hear things out there, let it know that the historical trauma that the genocide, ethnocide has created, even the relocation that was still happening up until 2010, we are still here, and we will continue to support that narrative that positive narrative that we believe in. And we are living in the time of the prophecies, and the prophecies are are related to all nations. All nations have a prophecy. And one of the things is that we have our medicine, our history, our culture. And knowing that, that's one of the biggest things that the COINTELPRO and, you know, the all the NSA, they know these things. And so that's why they held Leonard hostage. He is a prisoner of war. And this psyop that has happened over the years, he saw through that, and he advocated through that. He became his own advocate, and we need to stand behind him and protect him and make sure that historically this goes down in history, that his truth, and that he has been a man of integrity and a man of his word. And then I'd like to just say, you know, with Leonard being released, some of the things that we are celebrating are his connection to his life and to his family. And there's a lot of people praying now all over the world for him, but so that he can have a clean, you know, clean thoughts and a good path from wherever he is at this moment till the time he walks out of there. And that within 3 weeks, you know, he will be protected, and a million ancestors walk behind him. And we know that all the historical things we could talk about, all the genocide and the things that have happened to us, he has been an iconic member of our family and our relative. And so I just would like to say also that all the things that we talked about today, do your own research, and we support anything that you would like to send as far as a message, or you want to get involved in any way. And to stand strong. The prophecies that we are living in now are real, and there's no way that they can be stopped. No two-legged can stop these prophecies, and every nation has one. And so we come together in unity of the 4 colors of walks of life, and that is the unity we live by as Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tracker. And Leonard is an icon, but he is so tired of being a symbol of what happens when you stand up to oppression. He just wants to be Leonard. He wants to go home and have his grandbabies on his lap, and
Yes.
he gets to just be Leonard.
Yes.
And we are here to support him in any way that he needs.
Exactly.
Protect,
And
yeah.
that's what some of the prayers and ceremonies are for his connection to that spirit world, for his connection to his community, for his connection to the sacred fire that his community represents for him. That's what we are praying for, that his connection is strong and that it represents him and what he wants to do with his beginning of his new chapter of life.
Ward, do you have anything else you'd like to say?
Well, you know, I've been at this since the days when Steve Robidoux was running the Peltier committee out of a trailer in Rapid City. And I was a little younger then. You know, we're talking early 1980s. And it seemed like a long, long time to me, but imagine how long it seems to Leonard. You know, he isn't all the things that have already been said about him, but he is an amazing individual. Just to be able to bear it 48 plus years at this point. That's a whole lifetime for bulk of the population were being born time he went in or since. And he is coming out, and yes, he is still Leonard. He is still Leonard, and he never once backed down. That's amazing, remarkable, worthy of the utmost respect, and not to be abused for any purpose whatsoever. That's what I would say. You know, I was in the committee. I was a national spokesperson for the committee. And now I'm on the board of committee, different periods, whole different periods, completely different decades. The struggle has continued. And yeah, he symbolizes, as the government wanted him to, the consequence that comes with standing and not bending. But he is also a symbol of the perseverance of indigenous people, indigenous rights. And for that, we should be eternally grateful to him, not the other way around. Yeah, that's it. And now a new chapter begins, and it's the best chapter that I've seen in all that time I was talking about, since sitting there with Steve at that table in his trailer all those years ago. That's all I had to say.
Thank you, Ward. We do owe Leonard everything. He thanked me once, and I told him, don't ever do that again. You have taken the hit for all of us for 49 years now. He has been demanding for 50 years unity. Unity. He wants everyone working together, unity between the four colors. I was telling Jennifer that people in prison, after a couple of years, sink to the lowest common denominator, most of them. And Leonard has held on to his integrity and his principles all this time. All he would have had to do to get out was denounce his beliefs and beg forgiveness for something he did not do. And as you said, Ward, he was not willing to bend. We owe him everything, including his peace and his privacy. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to those that donated. Thank you to those that care. Thank you to the world. This has been a 50-year effort. You know, I'm a newcomer. There have been people that have given up their lives for this, given up marriages. I mean, it took the entire world saying, we will not deal with this any longer. We will not allow you to do this to this man any longer. So we are grateful to all of you, and I just can't wait until Leonard can sit here and watch this video. So we will wrap it up. Keep your eye on our website. Oh, Leonard I just put his originals on our website. He does have some original paintings, about 12 of them, also some purses. That's another way you can support Leonard, is his original artwork. That's his savings. That's his savings. As I said, the man should never want for anything again. Thank you. Until next time.